The world has lost faith in the United Nations, and this must necessarily become a part of the emerging fight for dominance between competing world views. That's what we're going to talk about in this video. The United Nations, love it or hate it, it's a symbol of the current, aging, creaking world order, set up to provide a forum for the nations of the world, but with a senior membership, the permanent members of the Security Council, the membership of which reflected the great powers at the time it was created. It was an attempt to emerge from a period of world wars and instability and power politics to one where problems got resolved on the basis of a rules-based order, while the big beasts, particularly the United States, could shrug off the occasional stings against them with very little consequence. Right now, I think there are two interesting questions relating to the UN and all that comes with it. One, if we are on the cusp of a change in the world order, with America declining and China ascending, maybe we are, maybe we aren't, but if we are, how will that become reflected in the new institutions, or how will it become reflected in the institutions from the old order? Will the UN be reformed or replaced? What will that look like? That, to be fair, is a longer-term question. But in the process of getting there, you would expect to see the existing institution degrade and reach a point of crisis as the old order breaks down, which comes in the second question. The crisis becomes the catalyst point where renewal is demanded and begins to show its form. There was an interesting article on Foreign Affairs website last week which argued that the recent Israel-Hamas crisis has exposed just how much the world has lost faith in the UN. And I thought it was worth considering the arguments it makes, because while the UN isn't shaping world events right now, how events play out there give you some clues as to the political dynamics that are in play that would otherwise remain unseen. You would expect the current crisis to hang heavy over the UN. After all, it was a vote at the UN General Assembly in 1947 that supported the partitioning of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states that set in train all of the dynamics that we see today and have seen for decades. And the consequences have been a regular feature at the UN. Frequent motions to criticise Israel, which frequently get vetoed by the United States. Frequently Arab states coordinating together to defend Palestinians, regular crises, lots of rhetorical fire and thunder, with not much of substance really changing. And that's a broad generalisation for a long bit of history, but it's essentially true. However, according to international security expert Richard Gowan, the author of the article in question, diplomats at the United Nations are telling him that this crisis, the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, and all of the ripples of consequences emanating from it, this feels different to all those other times. This crisis could spread from the countries concerned to the core of the United Nations institution itself. This reflects what is suggested to be widespread pessimism about the United Nations' future and a loss of confidence across the organisation amongst the staff who work there. The mismatch between an institution created around 20th century power relations and the modern era, that has been a feature for decades, but never before has the UN felt so helpless in the face of multiple crises, no longer seeing itself, never mind seen by others, as the accepted and natural place to go for solutions. Indeed, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres told the most recent annual General Assembly meeting that a great fracture in the global governance system was looming. Guterres has not always shown a deft touch in his personal handling of crises, to be fair. His comment about how the Hamas atrocity against 1,400 Israeli civilians didn't happen in a vacuum, giving the impression that the head of the UN was making excuses for that operation. That led to Israel calling for him to resign and raised rather a lot of eyebrows from other actors. Now, Gowan suggests the UN is running out of road, and he said this: soon national governments and UN officials will face a reckoning. They must confront the question of how the UN can contribute to peace and security at a time when the common ground among great powers is shrinking by the day. The UN had managed to keep basic consent amongst the great powers, but it provided a forum for thrashing problems out. It lived on the common ground. And even when they couldn't be, such as with the Ukraine war, it was still a place where hostile and divided nations could cooperate on other issues. For example, even though poisonously divided over the war in Ukraine, the UN Security Council was still able to coordinate on other matters. It imposed new sanctions on the gangs running rampant in Haiti. It agreed a new mandate for the UN to work with the Taliban in Afghanistan to deliver aid into the country. But by the spring of this year, 2023, that has started to come to an end. Specifically, Russia has started to act as a spoiler for the UN achieving anything at all. So Moscow forced UN peacekeepers to be withdrawn from Mali, ending a mission there that had lasted a decade. You might suggest that's no coincidence that Mali is one of the places where the Russian Wagner group has been active. In July, Russia vetoed the renewal of a mandate for UN aid agencies to deliver aid to rebel-held parts of Syria. But it's Israel versus Hamas that has really added fuel to the fire. Russia has gone aggressively for the US over its support for Israel in a way that's reportedly even annoyed Arab states, which perceive that Palestinian suffering is actually being exploited by Vladimir Putin for his own ends. But the United States' unconditional support for Israel has been the one that has greater diplomatic consequences. Specifically, the coalition of states that previously backed Ukraine after its invasion by Russia has broken over Gaza. Diplomats from developing countries have privately said that they might reject future UN resolutions in support of Ukraine in response to the lack of Western solidarity with the Palestinians. The point is that the institution has moved from one founded on a common understanding of the rules, the world order, the rules of engagement that oversees and constrains the relationships between states, to one where countries just split along lines of factional loyalty and self-interest. So then it doesn't really matter what somebody did, just whether they're inside or outside of your political grouping. Now, of course, you can never wholly escape those aspects. The UN hasn't been free from them ever from its inception. But once the framework is completely undermined, then the institution has no reason left to exist. It's not adding an extra layer. And it's obviously conflict management work where this becomes most clear, because the UN loses its authority to operate as an honest broker, and you can't do that kind of work without that status. And the UN's clearly recognised this, hence the pessimism to be found stalking its corridors. In July, Guterres released the UN's new Agenda for Peace. This was relatively low energy on the UN's traditional role in peacekeeping, more focused on encouraging its members to focus on new security threats, such as artificial intelligence. Well, it's an issue that's very relevant. But when the countries most affected chose to discuss it, wasn't the UN that they turned to. Instead, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak organised a summit. A group of countries coalesced independently around how they would take a lead. There's no evidence that the United States nor China want the United Nations to be given any sort of role in the regulation of technologies that they see as key to their future prosperity and security. This has always been the constraint on the UN. It's there as a vehicle for the wider community of nations, kind of under the sufferance of the major powers. This is why Americans specifically tend to value the UN so little. Who needs it, they ask, because they're sure they don't. The answer, of course, is any and every nation that worries about how the United States might abuse its dominant power at the expense of smaller nations, i.e. them. And the US always played a balancing hand in giving the UN enough weight to make that a valid and worthwhile process for those countries, while not accepting serious constraints on its own vital interests. Ironically now, it's as much the US forgetting how it's benefited from this, forgetting that it's not the only country in the world that is as likely to undermine its own world order as anything that China or Russia might do. Now, does this mean it all collapses tomorrow? No. There is a direction of travel, but this has a bit longer to play out. We may see a peak of crisis of confidence in the short term, followed by attempts to renew, to reform, to recommit, and that might keep the whole thing going for a bit longer. Likely, the new form only really emerges when we know who becomes the dominant world power for the next century. Will it be a renewed America, which has gone through its internal crisis, which is clearly determined to do, and has come out stronger? Or will it be China, which in spite of its own problems has nevertheless held itself together better than the US and emerged as the dominant player? Or do both of them go downhill, in which case, who knows how that goes? Now, that question could be decades in the answering, although it could just be a couple of years. No aspect of that timescale is in the UN's control. What is hard to see is how the UN re-establishes any kind of important authority. It will try hard, for sure. No doubt it will believe itself to have had a few mini-victories on the way. But Antonio Guterres was right. The world order is undergoing a major shake-up. And the UN can do little about it but watch and moan. They can always do that.